We're good to go. Yeah. First of all, I'm just going to encourage everyone to use your own timer. Yeah. Because maybe I'm not be able to keep time stamping in the chat. But second of all, please be respectful with everyone. Speaker POI preference, so to ensure that no one is being disturbed in this room. Yeah. Okay. So without any further ado, under the motion, this house predicts that the universe-based storytelling will significantly decline over the next decade. To open the debate, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister here.
Okay, give me a second. Okay. PI preferences, unmute, raise hand or chat, anything will be fine. Pronounce him. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The reason that universe-based storytelling will decline isn't because universe-based storytelling is necessarily bad, but it's simply that there is a limit to how many stories you can make, how many permutations of a universe that you can make before you start running out. And I think we're seeing this happen in real time with the Marvel series, for instance, where every movie feels exactly the same as the previous one, just with different characters and maybe slightly different context. The core idea is still the same. The superhero wins in the end. And we observe this in other universes as well. There is simply a limit to how far you can extend and push the characters and arcs within your story until the point where it is no longer interesting, thus no longer profitable, and people stop doing it. I want to set out 3 things. Firstly is specifically more on what universe-based storytelling is. We think that specifically it's about creating and then relying on specific fictional universes to place your stories into. And I want to note that to be permissive enough to allow many movies to be made, these universes are often incredibly massive in scale that encompass a wide variety of themes and a wide variety of topics. Like, I'm not even sure what the Marvel universe technically is about. I know it's about superheroes, but it has almost every theme under the sun. Harry Potter as well, for instance. I guess Harry Potter is better in this regard. The point is that it's often very massive and encompasses a lot of different themes that we think are all being milked dry at a very rapid pace. Secondly, we don't have to prove under our side that universe-based storytelling won't exist. We just have to explain to you why it will be rather muted in the next 10 years compared to now. And then lastly, this debate is a predicts motion. It's not enough for both sides to explain why there might be an incentive for publishing houses to switch off of universe-based storytelling, but that there is a compelling reason that perhaps prevents them from doing universe-based storytelling, or perhaps still allows them to do universe-based storytelling. That will be the only way we can know with a decent degree of certainty that universe-based storytelling will decline, and that's what OG will provide. Our premise is simple. We want to explain that we're simply running out of stories to tell in these universes that are distinct enough to be interesting. Firstly, I want to establish how permissive universe-based storytelling is to actors, directors, writers, and creators. I just want to note that obviously at the very start, these universes were created to be deliberately quite permissive. That's why we have superheroes, for instance, because you can create any superhero in your imagination and you can take that into an interesting, and you can, for some of them at least, you can take that in an interesting direction in a way that captivates viewers. This is why so far at least, Marvel has been okay enough up until Infinity War, making all of these movies about the different superheroes within their sort of comic book series and things like that. So we're not saying that you can't make stories in universe-based, or they're always going to be indistinct from each other. But the key difference now is that we're simply running out. Why do you think that we're systematically running out of stories within these universes? I think it's principally because they're being milked dry by the agencies and massive publishing houses that have these universe-based storytellings in the first place. I want to first note that it is going to be massive agencies and publishing houses because they're the only ones with enough budget, manpower, and the writing departments to maintain a coherent narrative within that universe that's often quite massive, that I don't think is usually possible for a singular writer or director to be able to accomplish. That's why often singular writer and directors often make one-off stories, for instance, and then if that gets developed into a universe, they have to get the backing of a bigger publishing house that's able to provide them the resources to keep that in track. Moreover, I think it's also because in these universe-based storytelling, the medium of art isn't just in one form. It's not just in movies. It often gets spread out into books, into shows, into musicals, for instance, and all of that is simply not possible if you don't have the financial and the manpower backing of a large publishing house. So what do these publishing and agencies have as an incentive that basically makes them milk these series dry? I think it's basically about how when they have their perception is that having a universe to be able to tell stories on is an easy way for them to get cheap money without having to necessarily make distinct stories. So That's why, for example, for Marvel, you observe that there's a very strict schedule in terms of when they make their movies, and how there's a lot of time crunch associated with those kinds of things. I think that's on general already bad for the directors and the people involved, because it means that they're being pressured to make bland movies all the time by the agencies in charge of these universes, but also means that you're running out of stories at a very, very quick pace, which is why we went through like so many similar arcs within the Marvel stories, and people aren't watching them anymore because, well, it's all the same. It's all about somebody, a plucky superhero that wants to fight against a god or wants to fight against their fate, for instance, and then succeeds in the end. We observe this with other universes as well. In Harry Potter, the original story is about a plucky boy that saves humanity or things like that. All the other stories after that is also about the player or the character within that story rising up, defeating evil, and then winning, which is exactly the same as the original story. And I think this happens because of the incentives of these publishing houses to make quick money by rehashing these stories or by maintaining such a large breadth of stories without the necessary amount of depth, and therefore leads to these stories ending becoming bland in the first place. And I think furthermore, the secondary reason why stories end up being non-distinctive is because they have to fit into existing narratives and characterizations within this universe. You can't make, for example, a Batman that is too interesting or too crazy because you have to fit into the backstory that he has. Sure, you can make a wholly new character, but you still have to find some way to make that make sense within the universe, which might or might not be possible. You can't, for example, go against the themes posited within the original Harry Potter, or for example, the experience of adulthood and things like that, because the original story was on that, and you need to fit your story in the general theme of that particular universe. And I think the impact is that you get largely bland movies that people don't watch, and that directors and new actors are obviously pretty unwilling to take part in. They would rather have their own personal one-off projects that are more interesting to them. They're able to show their personal vision without having to be tied to a certain kind of universe. This means less profit, less movies for these publishing houses, which means that they have to pivot to other things eventually. Yes, Kiara.
So you're saying Wicked is bad?
Honestly, I'm not a film fan, so I don't know, but I don't know, probably, maybe. I think it's possible that some movies end up being good sometimes, but it's probably not sustainable enough to the point that publishing houses can still rely on universe-based storytelling. I'm surprised if in the next 10 years Marvel doesn't switch off of their shenanigans and does something else, because they're not making that much money from the movies that they're making. And insofar that the other adaptations that other publishing houses are also doing are also not that successful now, and that they will only get worse from here, they have to switch off eventually. Comparative, you have very good one-off movies that don't necessarily establish a universe, or at least some small series, for instance, that's still very interesting, have fresh ideas. You have John Wick, where this guy literally just like kills everyone. You have, for example, Whiplash, that explores what it means to be a musician abused by the director. You have La La Land, for instance, talking about how tender love is, and all of these things that are possible because they're not tied down to those universes, and they're not pressured by these publishing houses to have a strict schedule in having a story for that particular universe. And the framing is like this. Maybe it's not immediately now that they will stop making these kinds of movies, but what we're saying is that we already have a shortage, and it's going to get worse in 10 years from now when more stories get made, rehashed, and readapted to the point where people simply cannot make interesting stories anymore, and they'll have to do something else. And that's why we propose.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for the speech. Okay, before we continue to OO, maybe some sort of reminder. I think if you have no any internet connection issue and are possible, we are highly encourage everyone to turn on their camera during the speech. But however, if it's having some internet issues or is it not possible, then yeah, it's fine. Just encouragement for everyone. So yeah, now moving on to the OO to open their case, I would like to welcome LO here.
Check, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. For POI, drop it on the chat box. I'm gonna start at closing if there's any. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Just want to give a brilliant clarification. The brilliant closing in opening opposition is not to say that to automatically rise or whatsoever. The burden is to simply prove that it will not decline significantly. So a slight decline is enough for us. A stable demand is enough for us, or even rise is going to be much better. But I just want to contextualize, right? That what does it specifically mean with this universe-based storytelling? I think we can divide it into two. Firstly, we're gonna talk about the pre-existing universe-based storytelling, basically everything in status quo that already exists, like Marvel Cinematic Universe, Star Wars, and everything. But secondly, it also connects to the creation of new universe. It looks like, for example, like as the history go throughout, like develop and whatsoever, we have newer universe created like Spider-Verse, who have just emerged in like late 2010s, or like Game of Thrones, who emerged in like late 2010s. So we also argue to you that this kind of emerging new universe, where it allows room for the creation of newer sequel or newer movies or TV series based on that, are also included in this universe-based storytelling from the get-go. So that we're going to prove to you that both of these business model are still going to be the most prominent one in the next 10 or the next decade. The parameter of whether this industry will climb or not, I think, lies on two parts. Firstly, is the demand side, whether people still want to view it or not, whether it's still entertaining and satisfying or not. But secondly, and most importantly, is regarding supply side, whether people still want to invest in the creation of such universe-based storytelling, the production houses, the streaming platform, etc. We're gonna pose it to you why both of these metrics are going to be fulfilled. Firstly, on the demand side, I just want to tackle their biggest claim, talking about, yeah, it will be boring because it will be predictable. But I just want to pose it to you that there is no real movie formula that are unique. Even when we're talking about independent movie like rom-com, they always have a certain formula, like, oh, there is a meet-cute, and they resent each other, and then they will finally get back together and live a happily ever after. It's every single movie have certain formula. I don't understand why simply having a formula means that quality will be bad. So even in their world, they also need to explain why such formula will not become a problem. But secondly, I'm gonna preamble about market shift. Exactly because the market are shifting and people have higher demand, it manifests into the creation of inclusion, or the inclusion of many more genres inside the universe. It looks like how Marvel Cinematic Universe back then only showed superhero like Iron Man, Captain America. But right now they're trying to tap into the comedic sector by having Guardians of the Galaxy, or horror market by having Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. It means that the market shift exactly incentivized this kind of universe-based storytellers to actually include much more different nuance or different genres inside their movie. It means that people ultimately will still be incentivized to watch this movie because the quality is still going to be high either way. But I'm gonna, if they want to talk about some example of good movie, I can also name drop some example of good universe-based storytelling. So I don't think that's the metric in this debate. As the metric should be what makes it uniquely important to have universe-based storytelling. Three such reasons. Because I think, firstly, argue to you that movie industry is very competitive with extremely high risk, especially now with sophisticated technology like CGI, like animation and everything, technological advancement and etc. It means that there is such a huge risk for many company when they want to create such movies. But why do creating universe-based storytelling give much more security to them? Because number one, audience are more likely to engage with your artworks when they are familiar with the characters, when they are familiar with the world setting, compared to just trying to introduce a new concept that might be quite confusing for some individual. It takes much more effort to make them wanting to watch the movie from the get-go because they're not familiar with such concept. But secondly, I'm going to argue that the pre-existing universe have loyal fans who are willing to invest, like in buying the tickets to watch movie, or even buying the merch and etc. Therefore, I think it serves as an incentive, or like a security net, that the idea will at the very least get some level of viewers. So we expect the continuous rise of it because with higher risk of creating movies right now, with the limitless opportunity in technology, like there are much more sophisticated CGI and everything, companies will always want to utilize this technology to maximize the quality. And the only way for them to gain security that at the very least someone people are going to watch my movie is when you have a system like the we have a buffer that some amount of people are going to watch it because it is an established IP or universe-based storytelling. But my second contribution is specifically talk about in the intellectual property, which are very, very prominent in many movies right now. What's the context? The context is that because of the high initial rate I've told you before, and with the limited screening opportunity right now, there are many more competitions here and there. I think it makes people realize that not only do they want to invest in the pre-existing movies or pre-existing universe-based storytelling, but you also create new universes. How does it look like? It looks like them making sequels to the movie, or trying to explore the third character in that movie, for example, not the main one, and etc. But how they explore it is not just by making movies, but by something called intellectual property. How does it look like? The monetization does not only come from the amount of money from the selling of the ticket, or the amount of royalty you get when you sell the movie to Netflix, but it goes to an extent of selling the merchandise. It goes to an extent of, like, even Disney use this model. For example, they have Disneyland that basically is the biggest source of revenue for Disney, not the movie. What is context important? Because I argue to you that intellectual property works best with universe-based storytelling. Talking about big players here, like Disney, like Marvel, who have such a huge theme park out there, or who have a huge amount of merchandise that people want to buy. The prerequisite of their IP sustaining is when they continue to use this universe-based storytelling. Why is that so? Because number one, single film have a limited lifespan, because at best people still watch the movie after 2 or 3 years, but then your intellectual property becomes meaningless, your merchandise, your theme park becomes meaningless when people no longer talk about it. But secondly, convert people from aware the movie and wanting to buy merch requires more than just one movie. That's why people would still want to invest in the pre-existing universe-based storytelling, but even more, they also try to build an ecosystem in their newly built movie, so that it could be a universe for the upcoming movie, so that the people want to convert not only based on awareness. But thirdly, it also allows a bigger market share, because now you have more characters that people can relate to. You might relate to the main character, but you relate to the side character. But the purpose of you relating to it is when you firstly become aware of the movie, when you're aware of the story. So this becomes important because it's the business model of many companies. Therefore, I don't care. Like, even in the worst case scenario that people demand is a deadlock whether they like it or not. But most importantly, companies should invest in existing universe-based storytelling because it's the prerequisite of their business model, like merchandising, like theme park, with a huge amount of initial investment. They don't want it to go to waste. Therefore, I think companies like Disney, like Pixar, would still make universe-based storytelling because their business are contingent upon it. But I'm also going to extend a bit on streaming platform and why it depends on universe-based storytelling. We're talking about Disney Plus, who relies heavily on Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that relies heavily on HBO, that relies heavily on Game of Thrones. This kind of company has such a huge amount of money to ensure that people are still wanting to watch their movie. They can fabricate the algorithm because of the huge bargaining power they possession, because of the huge capital they own. So exactly because their streaming platform relies heavily on this, so the business model of such company will invest massively on universe-based storytelling. At best, the supply side will control the market, and it makes sure that universe-based storytelling will not significantly decline. It will rise, but by just proving its slight decline, it's enough to make us win this debate. Proud.
All right, thank you all for that speech. Now, to continue the case of opening government, I would like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister here.
Wait a second.
Checking, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you so much. Please do POI only through Kaishan. Do not interrupt me. Wait a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The death of storytelling is already a good reason for investors to pull out, because they do not want to have severe losses if they still keep up on the long run. Why does this going to be important? I will explain it in my speech later. But I'll have 3 things in my speech that I'll explain. Firstly, why investors are not going to want to invest even if they can diversify the story. Second is about like all the things in barrier to entry, but second about like things that happening as why public houses is going to be bad and people don't want to support it anymore. First, let's talk about investors. Investors want money, but it is needed to be strategic. They can still pivot to another preference. What does this mean? It means that universe storytelling has been declining, and that's supposed to be a characteristic that opposition need to agree on. Why does that so? Because we already posted to you that all things in Marvel, especially coming to after Infinity War, has been declining. We see that people are not watching Quantumania and already hate it, or people are already hating Love and Thunder because it doesn't tell any story. It's already going to be such bland story that tells about like a hero that will save a child. That's all the thing that it is. It's not necessarily correlated. It means that it has lose its own touch and flavor, and people don't want to watch it anymore. This is why the characteristics already exist. But second, if we're talking about investor in this kind of story and has been like analyzing on why they still want this, at best, who is going to be invest is going to be a minimal amount of investor that probably like the story anyway. But that's not going to be enough, right? Why is that so? Because we know that in every story, if you want to make a good one, there needs to be like a higher cost in order to produce one. It means that you cannot, as a publishing house, you cannot say that you're going to create a better story after making a good one, because it will much more create grander expectation in terms of cost and prices. In so far that you will need to satisfy the watcher, you probably cannot produce a good one, especially in the near term, because you probably have a deadline in regards of how you can create your profit. This means that in the end, all the expectation that is pushed to the publishing house will not be able to be fulfilled. In so far that these stories are going to be run in a limited, and you cannot get so much crazier story. Because if you are pushing a different story than the other, people will it's going to be a risky situation that people might be like it or not. If people don't like it, it is simply a flop, and it's a huge process for the publishing house. This is why in the end, people that are investing to these stories are going to likely to opt out, because they don't want to watch it anymore, and they just got stigmatized by this whole bad movie. This is how easy people are getting turned off by this particular story, because they don't like that particular trope anymore, or just one film that becoming their downfall. But second thing that I want to explain is about barrier to entry. This is going to be engaging the OO's particular part on why they want to diversify. I think if they want to diversify, all this that to the problem that exists is that all tropes are probably has been used. If they want to be heroes, yeah, they're going to be heroes, but also especially the chosen ones like the universe, like Dune or even Harry Potter. These are trashy tropes that has been used over time, and people are probably getting tired of it. That there has been, and currently there has been less incentive over time for people to do this. We haven't seen any new universe that has been created, and this is supposed to be opposition burden to prove what are universes that probably going to exist in the end. I think this is at least to make sure that the delta is going to be higher, because they cannot just posit that it's going to be like slow decline or something. This is going to be hard, right? Especially when there's a lot of prerequisite to this. At least 3 things to maintain this. One is the fandom discourses from the loyal fans itself to get into the mainstream discussion is really hard. In so far that these things that are being taught in the book is probably going to be niche. This particular character probably is not conventionally attractive or have flaws that public are not well accepted, especially if the character is a minority, right? Therefore, if you want to posit that it can be simply accepted by the people and can easily blow out, it's not going to be that easy. But second, it's going to be labeled as new. It's going to be hard to distinguish for the password. Exactly, because it's already a used trope that people already recognize. This is why it's going to be different from like probably some kind of rom-com movies. That rom-com, at least people just watch it to be entertaining themselves, and in difference that people are watching universal storytelling to make sure that they can dive into the universe. These are different expectations that we are going to see. But lastly, it's a contesting marketability that is really hard for the universe to exist, because you'll be losing to bigger franchises to market it in the first place, or you'll be get sued if you think that there's going to be like similar in it. What does this mean? You probably get compared and people are going to antagonize you anyway. All this makes movies bland. Exactly that this is why people probably investors do not want to diversify anymore and will pivot to other movies like what Carlsson has explained. Like people will to good movies like Whiplash or even to La La Land that still tell one standing story that is inherently good. This is why I think barrier to entry is going to be really hard for new movies to exist suddenly and will die down eventually in 10 years. I'll take one. Oh.
Yep, every single week hundreds of movie are released. People have smaller purchasing power in this economy. So I think the risk on either kind of movie are symmetrical. How do you solve this deadlock?
In the end, if you are trying to talking about purchasing power, it doesn't going to matter anymore, because if that's going to be the case, people will also not going to care about buying your fan and merchandises. This is why intellectual property ownership is going to be asymmetric in the end of the day. But lastly, about problematic public houses. In order for a public house to gain profit, they probably need to push a certain cost in order for to create a better margin. What does this mean? They will sacrifice the amount of payment or like CGI cost in order to just create a trashy movie because they think people love it. This happened to Disney, right? when the animation has been much more lacking in terms of Marvel, but also that the sentiment of people in great public houses has been decreasing because they know they are publicly supporting like things like Israel. This means that probably people's sentiments in these public houses are not going to be so good in the first place. What does this mean? What does this prove to you in the debate? This creates an exclusive harm that probably that these kind of public houses are not going to be so much popular in the end, and there's going to be rise of indie that are going to be much more invested by the people, because this seen as the new pillar of movie. This is why universal storytelling is not going to exist. It's going to be decreasing in the next decades. About to open.
All right, thank you, PBM, for that speech. Now to close the opening half, I would like to welcome the LO here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, let me know if like suddenly my voice is gone. Hold on, let me drink. Alright. POI chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two clarification before getting into my rebuttals. First thing first, as a Harry Potter fan, I still think Harry Potter storyline is still exciting with the current development of the IP in the status quo. So I just want to tell you, Judge, that all of their assumption about it is only being a golden child that is discovered by Dumbledore is something that is false, because all of the increments that is happening in the story might not be visible towards all of the audience, but rather towards the fans that are inside of the niche. All of these stories are still deemed as exciting. It is deemed as surprising. It is deemed as something that could make them conserve inside of the fandom itself. So this is just to prove to you that basically they're cherry picking all of the cases that all of the stories are bad. Second of all, they also cherry pick the examples that all of La La Land and Whiplash movies are good. Yes, they are good because they are made by this. I forgot who are the sutradara or like the producer, but they are good because they're made by Damien Chazelle. But there are a lot of one single films that are bad in the status quo. So they're comparative that, hey, without this universe, there will be a lot of single films that are good. It's not something that is proven to be marginal benefit, because in fact there are also symmetrically a lot of bad movies in their set as well. Let's move into my rebuttals, right? 3 points of rebuttals here. Firstly, I just want to point out opening government's logical and analysis flaw that is interesting, because they peg the parameter of sustenance for this universe-based stories only from stories itself. We say that this is false. These are inherently intellectual properties that are being their whole business model. This is something that Danesh has already go in depth to. They're not always pegging towards stories. They peg to other form of attraction. For example, like Disneyland, they peg into like merchandises, they peg towards another amusing visuals inside of their merchandises and whatsoever. So it's not always about the stories as one of their incremental ways to sustain their fandom. I'll explain to this later. Secondly, they also oversimplify the breadth of stories, because in our side, stories are still incrementally explored in the status quo. They're not all bland. There are reboots, prequel, Life Before Harry has born in Harry Potter. We understand the dynamic between Ron Weasley or like Dumbledore and all of these NPCs that are inside of the main movies as the incremental storyline inside of the status quo. There are musicals like Harry Potter musicals of Golden Child. There are Wicked musicals as one of the IP that is one of the example in the status quo. What I'm trying to tell you here is that exactly because this is universe, there are, logically speaking, a lot of stories to be explained. With the time being, even like Harry Potter that has already been established since 25 years ago, there are so many people that are still unexplored. Like there are still a lot of characters that are still unexplored, meaning that there are a lot of expansion towards the stories and whatsoever. Even if stories are bland, this is only bland in our POV. As I said, for people that are inside of the fandom, it is actually exciting. You cannot just cherry pick Marvel is not interesting for you. Some people actually see Marvel as interesting. Third of all, third rebuttal, last rebuttal here is, I feel like we have no burden to prove the causality that in our side of the house there will be no decline in other short like single type of movies, i.e. when they try to prove to us like, hey, without this increase, then there will be a lot of La La Land and Whiplash adjacent type of movies. I feel like this is not within our burden. Our burden is just to prove the likelihood of the sustenance of the universe itself. Yep. If you want POI now.
assuming fans don't get bored eventually, which I don't think you structurally prove, why would it be easy for these publishing houses to make new good stories, given you've already explained a lot of the stuff has been explored already?
Yep, that would be the argument. So there are two main arguments that I'm going to tell you here. First thing first, we're going to prove to you the prediction of sustenance, at least for the 10 years in the future, by proving to you that the creative outlet for this universe-based stories is not only through stories, but through the adaptation of the changing lives of the society in status quo. Second of all, I'm going to prove to you why this will sustain, because there are an inherent business model that is pegged towards this industry that has already been done for many of years ago that proves to be sustaining until right now. Let's go into the first one. The most important extension here is in regards towards creative outlet. I want to tell you, Josh, that the unique case from universe-based stories is that its creative outlet is not only through stories itself, but basically they want to explore a lot of aspect of the visual. For example, they want to explore a lot of aspect that also adapts towards the society within time, so that it could enforce like reimagination or nostalgia for the long-term fans, and also it can introduce new characters towards the new fans. How is that? First thing first, they create and adapt through current social state. You see Superman universe now introduce Superwoman, for example, which makes people rethink their old perception of how a universe or how DC approaches superheroes at the very first place. Second of all, Spider-Man, for example, has the same storyline, but now they have a lot of universes, and one of them being a black Spider-Man as a form of representation, and he is very portrayed as someone that is very smart. And now MJ, for example, as one of the heroine, is now more empowered, more smart, and all of this reinvention towards the old character on through time is basically a perfect example, textbook example for you that all of this universe can sustain, because it needs to also adapt towards how the society is currently looking like. Second layer is that how does this sustain eventually? First thing first, two analysis here from the POV of the new market and also the old market. For the new market, when we tell them that there are Superwoman, that there are, Spider-Man that is black, for example, this will be amusing for them. This will cater the wokeness that has already happened in the status quo. This reimagine how DC or Marvel approaches story, and this basically makes a new mindset towards them. Second of all, this conserves old market, because now they have a sense of nostalgia, seeing the new characters have already evolved. For example, all of these fandom that are inside of the niche feels represented, and we think that all of this representation can only happen if you have already one base of stories that you can increment in societal complex. So comparatively, we prove that there's an incentive of sustenance, but not always through the increase of complicated stories, as what opening opposition say. We say that there are a lot of outlets to say that. Second of all, let's try to talk about like why IPs or businesses will sustain. We tell you that they adapt towards market demands, i.e. horror movies in Marvel. They make a lot of science fiction movies because there are a lot of demands, for example. What I'm trying to tell you is that what is unique from them is they are the one who curate the demand. They are the supplier that curate the demand. They can curate the algorithm. How does it look like? First, they can fabricate trends, like Sanrio Universe, for example, coming back because there's a trend of trinkets, of Labubu, and whatsoever. So nobody will know what the future might brings, what the trend might brings in the future, but all of this production house can fabricate all of these trends, so the demand will always be present. With all of that being said, we've already proved to you why this will sustain in the next 10 years. Very proud of it.
All right, thank you, DLO, for that speech that closed the opening half. Now, to continue to the closing half, I would like to welcome the member of GAF, Vieri.
Okay, hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. If you want to POI, just raise your hand. Yeah, I think just raise your hand. Okay. Thank my time. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna start my speech by teaching ITB about something about law, which is about intellectual property. You cannot extend the life of copyright just because you make another creation. The copyright of a Mickey Mouse is destined to only be for Walt Disney plus 70 years after his death. You cannot extend that more with any kind of thing. So after those 70 years, it will become public goods. I don't know what O is talking about. They also don't know what they're talking about. So please don't buy anything because this is the actual legal context that is real. So I want you to understand the burden of this motion is not to prove who will get benefit of this, either saying that either this is something good or not. We're just going to prove in CG why this is going to happen. And once we do it, we already win this debate. So I'm going to break the deadlock in the opening half. The OG just said that the movies are going to be bad, while the OO saying that the movies are going to be good, or at least it's going to still supply the market, right? But you have to understand, it's not about the movies are going to be good or bad, although I kind of agree with Carlsson that Fantastic Four sucks, but it's never about that. Making a bad movie does not mean that you cannot produce that continuously, just like what OO claimed. So it's not about that. CG will bring another angle, but before that, I'm going to explain to you two concepts. One, how the trends are looking right now, right? Who consumes this kind of things? I think it is really important analysis. There are two types of people who consume this universe-based storytelling. One is the bandwagon, people that watch movies for a date or maybe for a family night or just fill their free time. It's not comparative because either the movie sucks or not, they're still gonna watch these kind of movies. Even some people watch Merah Putih One for All. But secondly, there are these diehard fans, and this is the comparative. Why? Because these are the ones that are willing to spend their money to buy merch or claims, to do constant marketing by posting in their social media. These are the actors that are comparative in this debate. But before moving on, I'm just going to prove the data on why I will prove something is true. So Endgame, that came out in 2020, I think, or even before, they got $2 billion in box office. Where right now, Fantastic Four, I don't think they really reach $500 million. So there's a significant decline, more than 3-4. I'm gonna prove why it's gonna happen again for the next decade. But secondly, I'm gonna characterize to you more about the actors. Who are the actors that are involved in any of this, right? 3 actors. One is the consumer, second is the author, and thirdly is the production house, right? One, consumer. Who consumes this kind? Who is this diehard friends that I'm talking about? Mostly it's our generation. I don't know if we're that different in Egypt, but I don't think we're that different. Ranging to 15 to 25 years old right now. Why? Because nowadays kids, I don't think they watch Iron Man because they have to follow very, very long time of watching the marathon MCU. I don't think they want to do that. They prefer Baby Shark. Or the boomers, which are millennials above us, like the 40s, like my parents. They don't really like Thor. They just watch Thor because Chris Hemsworth is handsome. So these kind of people are not fans. But we, people that are ranging 15 to 25 right now, we grow up watching these kind of movies. We grow up watching Iron Man, Harry Potter, thinking that maybe I can be Spider-Man, right? But now we are now in a varsity debating. We no longer live like a children. We no longer have the fiction of a children. Therefore, we no longer idolize them. I will later prove why emotional connection matters. That's the characterization of consumers and who are these diehard fans. But secondly, about the authors, they're most likely old, if not dead, right? Like Stan Lee, Walt Disney, Shakespeare to some extent, or like J.K. Rowling. She's old. She no longer creates any books, right? There's no new stories. So the current and on-progress movies or stories, either it's books, novels, movies, it's written by someone else, not the original author. But lastly, the producers, production house, studio, they're focusing on profit. And right now, looking at the market trend, indie movies are better, like Anora, Weapon, or even F1, the biggest hit in 2025. So if they want to invest in Korean movies, this is where they're going to invest because this is the biggest return on investment. But I'm going to move on to the extension. What the hell am I talking about for these 4 minutes? Wait, Dennis. So I'm just going to tell you a story about emotional attachment to the past creation. Like you have to understand, these diehard fans are worshipping past creations. Star Wars fans are worshipping Revenge of the Sith, the 3rd Star Wars movie, the prequel, the best of the best. They don't want to see any other Star Wars movies. People are worshipping Avengers Endgame, and they don't really want to watch Thunderbolt, Fantastic Four, or whatever. And when Danish said Game of Thrones, literally people are worshipping Game of Thrones Season 7, and they wanted to erase the Game of Thrones Season 8 because it's not based on the novel. You have to understand that context. So people, diehard fans that love this kind of storytelling is actually having the emotional attachment to past, something that they watched when they're kids. And they're actively hating these new movies or creation because of 4 things. But before that,
We proved to you that there are trends to create new universes in status quo that serve as a safety net to their huge investment. Why would they make independent movie on your site then?
Great. So once again, this is integrated this. Listen to this. One, it's not based on the real author anymore. Stanley's gone. You cannot replace him. His idea is the one that's making MCU to this big. And since he's dead, I'm sorry to say, MCU is fucked, right? So you have to understand, without the real author, and you can create whatever stories that you want, doesn't make it any better. So I kind of agree with OG here, that you cannot create any better movies without having the real author alive with us. But secondly, it's not the same as watching these kind of movies when we're 12, when we're still believing that the world is naive, and when we're still naive, when we believe that the world is going to be acting really great to us. We watch these kind of movies without our mind on, so therefore we believe that there are certain people that can fly, that can hang around buildings like Spider-Man. It's no longer the context for us right now. We're in college, Dana is in ITB, and I'm struggling in law student as a law student in UE. So the feeling and attachment to this kind of creation is no longer the same. Thirdly, the actors are backing up. You have to understand, Scarlett Johansson, Chris Evans are now do not want to be integrated with Marvel anymore. And fourthly, we can't remake something that's iconic. That's why Black Panther 2, when they replace Chadwick Boseman, gets really, really much hate. So what does all of my stories prove? This proves that right now, the fans that supposedly the backbone of all of this to support this creation now becomes your enemy. For example, the Superman of David Cohen Sweat, there are two kinds of people that still support Henry Cavill or support the current Superman. You cannot really have the one fan base as a whole to support your new creation. That's my point. As insofar you have half of it only, you'll get significantly decreased. That's why we win, because it's gonna happen.
All right, thank you, member of Government, for that speech. Now to continue to the case of member opposition, I would like to welcome member of op here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you both.
Okay. Let me drink one second. Okay. PI unmute. Will not be looking at the chat box. Yeah, just unmute if you need. If you want to do any PI. I think my speech in 3, 2, and 1. We agree with OO that government burden is not only to prove that why it is going to decline, but why it will decline significantly in the next decade. This is why CEO's extension becomes important, because CEO's extension will show to you why even if there is going to be a decline, a little like going through ups and downs through this decade, in the next decade it will jump back up. This looks like Iron Man in 2011, where no one gives a shit about it. But people certainly care about Iron Man in Infinity War and any other Marvel movies, for example, simply because Iron Man keeps on appearing and people seems to like his character development and so on and so forth, therefore lifting up the universe from back on until 2011. And people watch those movies and so on and so forth in order to watch the progression of Iron Man, either be it progression via storyline or character progression and so on and so forth. This is important because compared to OO, they only explain to you why there is still going to be a demand. CEO will engage to you on governance-based case scenario why even if the barrier of entry is that high, it is going to be still a winning type of point under CEO. Two main extension. First issue on company's approach. Second extension on incentive and capacity analysis of the viewers. First issue on company's approach. Number one, I think we're talking about companies that are really big in the current status quo, like Disney, Marvel, etc., that are monopolizing the market. This analysis is important because it's their only way of approach and money-making machine. They have to do this in order for them to have a media control, for example, in order for them to garner more viewership, in order for them to gain more fan bases, and so on and so forth. Therefore, what we show to you exclusively under CEO is that these companies are monopolizing anyway until the end of the day, even in the next decade. Therefore, until the end of the day, they're still going to be able to monopolize the market and create the same movie anyway, because this is the only way that they operate, because they simply cannot create a new approach. Second, when it comes to investor, I think they have been in a long-term contract with the investor. Therefore, they easily pull out and make any kind of other movies. For example, this also binds the actor, the production houses, for example, simply because they have an agreement and are bounded by investor in the long run. Therefore, they're still going to create it even until the next decades and so on and so forth until the end of the day. Second extension on incentive and capacity analysis. Firstly, I'm going to reframe how does this look like. Four things. Number one, three things. Number one, these movies are chronological, or at least there are interconnectivity within each stories like Infinity War, Endgame, Iron Man, and Spider-Man, and so on and so forth. This means that each movies are going to have each movie introduction, like short movie, for example, in the start of the movie, like previously what happens in the previous movie and so on and so forth. Second, there are still going to be glorification in media before each release of new movie. Like how, for example, before Avengers Endgame release, movies platform like Netflix is going to promote Infinity War, Iron Man, Spider-Man, and so on and so forth to make people fear of missing out. How, for example, they are going to be a lot of discussion in social media, promotion on large scale about the previous movies and spin-off for people to watch, for example, in order for them to understand these kinds of movies. Three, there are still going to be a lot of details, either major or minor Easter eggs, and that foreshadows and link to other movies, for example, and it's still going to be utilized by them in order for them to promote, for example, or is how there is going to be a discourse and discussion within the fans, either social media, movie, platforms, and so forth. Why is this portrayal important? Because OG and CG's main concern is the barrier of entry, which OO never answers on why, for example, until the end of the day, a lot of people are going to be able to have access of entry until the end of the day, even if they do not watch from Iron Man 1, for example. Therefore, it leads to deadlock on opening debate. CEOs resolve this by explaining to you why there is an inherent incentive for them to actually want to do a glorification in media before the release of the new movie, or how, for example, they're still going to do a lot of introduction like short movie, for example, or exclusively a new spin-off and short movie before the release of the big movie like Infinity War or Endgame, for example, just so people can catch up. Then this diminishes the importance and urgency of OG about barrier of entry. But last second, because the demand is so and people are always fear of missing out and hype this, CG's case becomes unimportant because eventually there are still a lot of market to be tapped into anyway, even if J.K. Rowling dies or whatever that is that they want to explain to you, because these new writers are still going to be able to utilize this anyway to create new movies, even if it is not based on the original or the original writer. It is not that important because at least what we show to you, there is still going to be a lot of demand, and how, for example, universe-based storytelling is not going to be declining significantly. In order for CG's case to run, they need to explain to you why, just because it is not made by the original writer, it is going to significantly decline, which they have never proven. Second, the whole case of OG is to explain to you that we're going to run out of story. CO will show to you why the story will not run out and mechanize OO's case about customer loyalty. What is the most important thing in this debate? It is the nostalgia that these people have. I admit that we all have explained to you about nostalgia, but I'm going to run in deeper about why these people have the incentive to intergenerationally always bring in their nostalgia to other people and even to the chair and so on and so forth. Why do people watch these movies? Simply because of the consensus out there, it is for escapism. But who are the loyal viewers? Number one, the viewers were nostalgic, like people growing up reading about Harry Potter and growing up seeing the movies like getting a remake, therefore they are hyped for it. People reading Marvel Universe, etc., that are still waiting for new stories to be remade and released in cinema, for example. Second, the stories are literally 1,000 pages long and are divided into a lot of different books. Like you see a lot of books that are really wide, for example, in Harry Potter, on Marvel movie, Marvel story, and so on and so forth. This is important because the context is on the next decade. There are still a lot of fans that are willing to follow the news and see the next adaptation. Before that, sure, whoever that is.
Firstly, every company does promotions. Secondly, promotions don't work when people see or perceive that it's going to be a bland movie. They will just watch old movies if they're that nostalgic.
Sure, number one, because they do promotion exactly, it proves our case. Second, I'm not sure why people will automatically see it as a blank movie, given that it is going to be hyped anyway, and people are going to discuss a lot of plot twists and discussion in social media. Therefore, people are still going to be hyped about it anyway. But number three, because of how, for example, these people are living a lot about it, and this is a nostalgia, they are still going to have the incentive, for example, to fast forward to their child in the next decade, for example, the memories that they grew up with are something that is important to these parents, that they will tell about those stories like bedtime stories and so forth. Therefore, these kids will also have the incentive simply because they are growing up getting read those kinds of stories by their parents. Therefore, they are willing to also watch the kind of movie simply because it is hype and it is something that is intergenerationally storytelling by their own parents. But the second thing is on sustainability. There is still going to be a lot of theories about next films, discussion of plot twists, and so on and so forth that keeps people to want to be engaged at the end of the day. But lastly, on familiarizing. The reason why people care about all movies are when character keep on appearing on each movie and gets added more layer of analysis on background of each character, like character development, story, and character development, for example. This is the exclusive benefit from CO to make sure the movies keeps on increasing and keep on flowing up under CO oppose.
Right. Thank you, member of opposition, for that speech. Now to conclude the case coming from government, I would like to welcome government with Vieri. All right. Thank you, government whip, for that speech. Now to close the case coming from the opposition, I would like to welcome opposition whip period.
Sorry. Assuming I'm audible and visible. Just coming up if my voice suddenly turns choppy.
Yes, you go.
Okay, thanks. Starting my speech in 3, 2. One. On top of my speech, I'd like to point out 2 points of framing. Firstly, all of the government branches lost this debate because even if they explain why universe-based stories will significantly decline on their side of the house, there are no structural reasons on the comparative on their positive material as to why Beverly real-life movies or non-fictional movies will still exist or will still, increasingly exist on their side of the house. They gotta just posit 1,000 reasons why this is bad, because I can just say the same thing with them, that the demand for real-life movies is naturally decreasing on their side of the house anyway, so it's symmetrical. It is a huge law the government did not answer. But secondly, I like to point out our pathway to Victorian CO, right? There are 2 sub-points here. First, regarding irrespective of demands, we exclusively tell you how the industry naturally works, which means it is a monopolistic, money-hungry, like what CG told you, and therefore, irrespective of the loss of audience, like what government web told you, that means the production still exists, and noting the fact that our ability is to prove why universe-based movies still exist, and therefore, because it's their business models keep producing this, irrespective of the market demand, that means we win because we prove that it's going to exist. But secondly, we tell about the demand from people, right? How most of the time the next generation are people who are starting to grow now, from children, teenagers, and probably adults. And probably it's not like the age of 70 or 80 years old anymore. That means there's a huge legacy from the past. They probably start having kids like what Alberto, and there's huge incentive for them to watch this type of movies, universe-based movies, basically. So let's just there are 3 things I'm going to do. 2 things I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, engaging to both government branches because they seem to have similar cases. But secondly, I like to compare with OG, why we win over OG even on a tiny bit. I prove why it's very, very important. Firstly, let's just with OG, right, and CG. Basically, tell you that the ideas are limited, and CG tries to extend it because the authors or the idea creators are basically dying and aging. But this is not true as well, right? Because 2 structural reasons. Firstly, humans are creative and there are generational incentives to put that legacy, like how we can put Marvel new heroes as well, like because there's also a sense of competition there. But second, huge incentives to diversify, to pinpoint. That's why Disney starts to do like initiatives remakes, like how she used who's that I forgot the black girl to play Ariel. But but literally this is all this thirdly, this is also statistically not true, because literally WeCat is one of it's one of the most selling films, and we can also introduce new universe, remake film movies. But the silver lining on this point is that non-fictional movies and fictional movies can have their own attractiveness at its own respectives, and ideas can probably still exist. So maybe like we're good at Wicked, probably you guys are good maybe at Sore or etc. Because there are lots of things that are contributing to these factors and why these certain movies are attractive or not. Because for probably like their storyline, the casts, song tracks, etc. This is symmetrical. So OG and CG have no case at all. But even if like we want to engage with how writers have limited ideas, let's say, firstly, this is literally like how the company works. I think the symmetrical example will be like designer brands, like Giorgio Armani, just that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Armani will be dying and will not, like Dior and Chanel can still exist as as well. And especially we're talking about big companies. We're talking about monopolistic companies. Anyway, so even if ideas are limited, and even if like writers are limited, why there's still like a production of this? And this is very, very important because we tell you how industries work. Firstly, because monopolistic nature of this film production companies like Disney and Marvel, which is their business model, is to actually introduce universe-based movies, and it's actually the legacy of past years, of past decades. But secondly, because most of the time they have already appointed long-term contracts. That means, firstly, because they have huge and competitive and they want to reserve high-rated actors for quality, or maybe like because good films take time, like 4 or 5 years. Since we're talking about the next decade, that means with the way in here is that we're exclusively telling the legacy of film production. Probably they made the contract in 2017, and probably it ends at like 2020, and probably ends on 2026. And there are lots of upcoming Marvel movies. We'll tell you the exclusive, the legacy of film production. That production will still be there because the companies are still there and still doing the same business model. Although that they are redoing the actors, they're recasting the actors or diversifying the characters. That is still there. Therefore, the conclusion is that probably like what their POI promotion doesn't necessarily annihilate like real life movies. That is true, but our is to prove why universe-based movies are still there. So besides their case is non-existent, the production house is still there, is still strong and still competitive. Therefore, the villains are still there. Are still there. Before moving on to my second issue, I'll take OG.
The idea of maintaining legacy as an incentive is new in OW, by the way, but our case already answers that, because when executives see the trend is lower profits, they will force directors not to make those kinds of stories.
That's literally not statistically true. If that is true, like they will not make the remake of Fantastic Four, like what CJ told you, and also like they will not make Marvel's second generation movies. Literally not true. Second issue about relatability, right? I think what their main case is about is that people are bored. This and also like people are not relatable at all because like they're adults, like what Jones told you. But literally, there's few structural reasons why people will still want to watch it, and this is very exclusive panels. Firstly, because universe-based movies are based on storyline from like generations, like how Wicked from animation to human adaptation, or like Ariel. There are children who watch that, but adults and uni students literally watch that as well because that makes them remember of their childhood when they watch Wicked animation with their parents. This is the exclusive reason why people still watch it. But second reason on the legacy is because probably people love the production house. So maybe they hate Wonder Woman, but probably they still want to watch Wonder Woman because it is produced by DC. But second structural reason why this is true is because people watch movies for no reason, because they want to spend time with their friends, or maybe because they don't want to care about the substance, but they want to care about the aesthetics of the movies. So you don't have to watch the whole Marvel movies to watch Endgame, and there's no peer pressure for it. No, you can just open streaming platforms or buy tickets for 70 to 75K, and you can watch Endgame. So literally there is no case at all regarding relatability. What will happen in the next decade, and I will prove why relatability will actually increase or stay on our side of the house, because people right now in the next decade will grow up, we will work, we'll probably become managers and stuff. So firstly, these are children or teenagers who are exposed with universe-based stories like Wicked or maybe like Disney's or Marvel's. But secondly, probably we are trying to work and start to experience the gist of life. That means we're trying to make families, get married and stuff. That means real life, what is the problem with real life movies? Firstly, it is too relatable and too realistic to the point that you will have PTSD. So if you're watching a Pat Adalah Mouth and you're a cheater, definitely you will not watch it. And if you have experienced being cheated upon, then you will not watch it because there are huge incentives for the movies to be as relatable as possible. Secondly, I think these movies will be similar with their lives, but then that means boring. And that's why like real life movies are faster to be commercialized in streaming platforms. On our side, to provide escapism, because firstly, it is aesthetically pleasing, and secondly, digestible. And lastly, then regarding OG, firstly, I think all of their case about demand, but we told you irrespective of demands, the companies are still there. We don't care about IPR because we don't care about the loss of audience. We engage with the worst case scenario, or we break the death law that because the companies are still there, and secondly, huge incentives for people to rewatch and just go to the movies for no reason. For all those reasons,